Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you to the organizers for putting on this meeting. I want to add that in addition to Dr. Chamberlain, who is the new president of Environmental Health Trust, we're joined today by Dr. Robert Brown, a senior diagnostic radiologist, and I'm going to be sharing my talk with them today, and we'll begin by our overall presentation today is on making the invisible visible, which is the focus now of the work of Environmental Health Trust under the leadership of Kent Chamberlain as president and Robert Brown, vice president for scientific research and clinical affairs. Joseph Sandry, who is our vice president and general counsel, is not joining us in this presentation today, but that makes up our senior leadership team, along with Vice President for Administration, Sharon Kennemwe. As you heard, we've published a book called Disconnect, which is in fact available on Amazon, and I hope that you will share it with your colleagues. It is now full of updated materials, including a preface by the former president of Microsoft Canada, who has joined us as a member of our board of directors, Frank Clegg, and practical solutions for how to engage in safer technology by our former executive director, Theodora Scarrato. I'm thrilled to be working with Kent Chamberlain, who is the past chair and professor emeritus of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. He's worked for more than 4 decades in academia for a number of groups and held the prestigious Fulbright Distinguished Chair, as well as serving as associate editor for the IEEE, where he regularly performs reviews on peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Chamberlain came to public attention most recently for his work with the New Hampshire State Commission, which was convened by legislation of the New Hampshire legislature. And he has worked now with national legislators and community groups around the world to promote awareness of the need to reduce exposures to environmental factors that emit radio frequency radiation, also known as microwave radiation. Robert Brown is also joining us today, and he will follow my presentation, speaking to you about the latest science on human impacts of electromagnetic fields. He is expert in that because he's a senior diagnostic radiologist who has worked as an ultrasonographer as well as interpreter of all of the complicated imaging that we now get if we are in medicine today. He's the author of Toxic Home, Conscious Home, a mindful approach to wellness at home. I should add that none of us today is being compensated for our presentations. We are speaking today in an effort to promote the safer use of wireless radiation and encourage competition for safety. For more information, please do look at our website, ehtrust.org, and sign up for our newsletter on that site. Now, what emits wireless radiation? This image, which appeared in Environment magazine, shows a number of the agents in the home today and nearby that can emit microwave radiation. Everything from your wireless keyboard and printer to your microphones, your headsets, your AirPods, they all emit various levels and various types of power of microwave radiation. What we know about all living things, whether from plants to animals, is that we are all united by the fact that we share DNA that is basically the blueprint that tells all of our cells what to do, whether to become fingernails or toenails or brain cells. That DNA is within the nucleus of every living cell, of every living thing, whether it is plants or animals, big ones or little ones, and also humans. And you will see that that link of DNA is what we must pay attention to, because studies that have been done in insects, in trees, in bees, in birds, in higher animals, all show that electromagnetic fields can damage DNA. This is what DNA looks like microscopically. You see the nucleotides, and you see here, this image just illustrates the breaking apart of the nucleotide bonds that holds together DNA. And research has confirmed repeatedly that electromagnetic fields have the capacity to damage DNA at different levels of many different species. Radiofrequency radiation has also been shown to damage trees through observational studies. This is work from Cornelia Balsam, where she has shown and published that damage to the tree typically starts on the side facing the tower, seen here in this image in the red rectangle. This is the tower. And you can see that the tree literally looks like it's trying to move away from the radiating tower. Damage typically starts on one side and eventually extends to the whole tree. Now, you can see this movement away again here in this image from Waldman Selsam's work, also done with Alfonso Balmori of Portugal. And they have repeatedly shown this damage to trees. The question is, what kind of damage is this? Well, studies that my colleague and I, Malka Halgamug from Australia, New Zealand, produced in 2019 showed that over 1,100 studies, which we analyzed, more than 60% of them showed evidence of DNA damage. DNA damage within the leaf structures of these growing plants. And this same phenomenon of DNA damage has been found in bees as well as in rats and rodents, which are used to predict effects in human beings. The exposure of bees to 5G radiation has been demonstrated to induce heating, but has also been shown recently. You see here, this is the Western honeybee. The honeybee's wings, when it's healthy, beat more than 11,000 times a minute. And the worker bees in the hives are predominantly female, and their job is to get the job done of producing honey and protecting the hive. And they work, of course, in teams. But globally, there's been a decline in honeybees. Now, we don't know all the reasons for that decline, but one of them is certainly pesticides. Another is certainly climate change. But we submit that another contributor to the decline of honeybees could well be microwave radiation, a phenomenon which is not well studied, but merits serious attention. This is an analysis of what happened experimentally to honeybees with electromagnetic fields turned off, seen in the top left. You see here that if the towers are far away in blue, there's very little effect. But when the towers are closer in green, you see that there is, the further away the towers are, the further in time the exposure takes place, the lower the effect on heat shock protein. Now, heat shock proteins are necessary for life. And when the electromagnetic fields are turned on, seen here on the right, you see this increase. Even in the faraway towers, you see an increase in heat shock proteins here on the top right. And even up to 40 minutes that remains, and then it just drops off after 60 minutes. This is the exposure is only turned on here for the first 15 minutes. 15 minutes of exposure increases heat shock protein in the honeybee. And here you see cryptochrome, which are other critically important agents to honeybees. And the cryptochrome is here elevated, and the heat shock protein here is increased with a stress response increased when you have the towers turned on in red versus turned off. So you see the increase in the heat shock protein when the electromagnetic field is turned on. And you see that there's no change or little change when it's turned off. These others, here, the cryptochrome is here, and you see again that it's almost 2 times lower when the tower is turned on, seen here in this box with the CRY2. This is the cryptochrome 2, which is thought to be critical to navigation and other factors in the health of the honeybee. So we have microscopic studies of the impact of electromagnetic fields on the honeybee, and that has been demonstrated experimentally. And you see a number of other expressions. This is superoxide dismutase. This is other heat shock proteins. And again, you see stress responses are doubled when the electromagnetic field is turned on in the individual honeybee. Now, another study published by the Odemer and Odemer in 2019 showed that if you looked at a group of larvae that are to hatch into the bees, including the queen bees, normally larvae will produce a certain amount of queens with hatching, seen here on the green, which is the control. But with electromagnetic field exposure, just 2 weeks of phone radiation exposure during this critical gestation, there's a 44% drop in the number of queen bees. Now, obviously, the queen bee is critical to production of life for the hive. And although this appears to be reversible, the long-term effect of this damage to the honeybee remains unknown. Now, just to complete the message about how important DNA is throughout all living things, not only do we show damage to DNA in the plant and damage in the honeybee, the National Toxicology Program, which is the state-of-the-art study of how chemicals affect all of us, demonstrated in a 2-year study costing more than $25 million that rats and mice exposed to the equivalent of 36 years of exposure developed rare malignant cancers in those animals parallel to those that we've seen in people. These cancers included gliomas, which is a usually fatal cancer of the brain, and schwannomas, a rare tumor of the nerve sheath, as well as a number of precancerous changes in the brains and hearts of animals, and DNA damage in rats and mice with lower birth weight in the offspring. So the original report from the National Toxicology Program in 2018 said these findings support the International Agency for Research on Cancer determination that mobile phone radiation is a possible carcinogen to humans. There's been a lot of politics about that report, which you'll hear about from our president at the end. In general, this science has been very difficult to conduct because it's been conducted in a political microscope where the weight given to the industry point of view is much, much greater than that given to that of objective science. And that is why a number of scientists have organized to create a separate group, the International Commission on Electromagnetic Fields, that Dr. Chamberlain is a founding member of. The importance of cancer studies in rodents, I cannot overstate. The reason we look at rodents is we want to study animals in order to prevent and predict effects in humans. We know that every agent that causes cancer in animals will produce it. I'm sorry, and I hope you'll edit this in the revision. We know that every agent that causes cancer in humans will produce it in animals when adequately tested. That is in the preamble to the World Health Organization International Agency for Research on Cancer. Almost a third of the subjects that we know for sure will cause cancer in humans have been identified in well-conducted animal studies and were found to do so only after the animal studies indicated carcinogenicity. So we want to pay attention to what the animals are trying to tell us. We must learn from the animals because we do not want to treat ourselves and our children like subjects in an experiment without any controls. We, at Environmental Health Trust, we have worked with a number of organizations to demonstrate that the current limits do not protect wildlife, the natural environment, or people. We have submitted evidence to the FCC and the FDA, repeatedly showing that current levels affect insects and birds' behavior and health, as I showed you in some of the slides presented earlier today. Environmental assessment is needed, and that was the determination that the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reached in 2021. Now, Dr. Chamberlain will share with you that while the Court of Appeals was reviewing the data in 2021, the FCC secretly tested phones, and the results of those secret tests were only made known to Environmental Health Trust with the release of Freedom of Information Act requests quite recently. Phone use has increasingly been linked to technoference. Studies have been done showing that mother-child pairs, dyads, have increased hyperactivity with exposure during pregnancy. Other studies have found that the most basic human interactions, those of parents and children, husbands and wives, are interfered with by technology. This phenomenon has become so widespread that the psychiatry world labels it as technoference. It has now become the subject of books and conferences, and we understand that technology is disturbing the most important and intimate parts of life today. And indeed, there are internet addiction camps. There are ways to detoxify families from the addictive properties of technology. And this is becoming one of the major foci for Environmental Health Trust under new leadership. Now I turn it over to Dr. Rob Brown, who is going to talk with you about the human health effects from radio frequency radiation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Very happy to be here today. Let me share my screen. Okay, does that look good?
Robert, would you be able to do the advanced tab?
Okay.
You just stop sharing and then do portion of screen. Hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hit the green button, share, and then on the top where it says advanced. Perfect, looks good.
Great. Okay, thank you. It's very happy to be here and contribute to this critically important topic. Carrying on in this next section, I'm going to cover some specifics about the health effects that can occur from exposure to non-ionizing radiation, and in particular, radio frequency radiation, that emitted by cell phones and wireless technology. Who am I and why am I interested in this? Well, as Dr. Davis mentioned, I'm a board-certified diagnostic radiologist, and I've been practicing for over 30 years. And what that means is that I've been interpreting the images that are created by exposing the body to both ionizing forms of radiation, that is, in X-rays, CAT scans, angiograms, but also non-ionizing radiation. When somebody has an MRI, they're placed in a strong magnetic field and the body is bombarded with radio frequency radiation, and the actual atoms in the cells vibrate and get knocked off axis, and that process enables us to get images. So I'm very familiar with the penetration of radiation and some of the physiological effects that we can see from that exposure. I did become interested in the health effects of environmental toxins, and I did write the book Toxic Home, Conscious Home, which was my venture out into this realm. And I looked at both biochemical toxins and also energetic toxins, such as light and electromagnetic fields. And that's really what brought me into this arena here. And Dr. Davis and the board invited me to become the Vice President for Scientific Research and Clinical Affairs at the Environmental Health Trust, which is a wonderful opportunity for me. So in this segment, I'm going to discuss some basic physics just to make sure that everybody understands what radiation is. And then we're going to go into some of the nonspecific cellular effects of EMFs, and then look at the biological and physiological repercussions that may occur from that nonspecific cellular effect. And finally, I'm going to give you some recommendations. So to begin with, it's important to understand that all radiation is a form of energy and it travels in waves. Those waves can be distinguished from one another by their wavelength and corresponding frequency. We can easily demonstrate this by shining a white light through a prism. Because the white light is composed of different wavelengths in the visible light spectrum, they will separate from one another due to differences in their refraction and produce a rainbow pattern. So each of the colors of the rainbow have a different wavelength and a different frequency. Because all electromagnetic radiation travels at the same speed in a given medium, the wavelength and the frequency are inversely proportional to one another. If you look at the graphic on the right, the blue wave on top has a high frequency and a short wavelength, whereas the red waveform on the bottom has a long wavelength and a low frequency. Now, the visible light spectrum is only a very small component of the electromagnetic spectrum, which you can see here, which includes frequencies from 1 cycle per second, or is termed extremely low frequency, all the way up through gamma radiation. In the natural world, we experience the Earth's magnetic field and the continuous rhythmic pulsations of the Earth's vibration, which are called Sherman resonant frequencies. And superimposed on this, we experience the diurnal cyclical exposure of sunlight, which is composed of visible light, infrared, and some UV. Radio frequencies are not found in any significant intensity in our natural world. These frequency bands have been tapped for industry for the purposes of wireless communication. With any radiation exposure, the greatest intensities are located closest to the source of the radiation, and they rapidly dissipate with increasing distance. In this slide, you can imagine that the flashlight, which is a source of electromagnetic radiation, is close to the hand and the hip, and so those parts of the body are going to receive the greatest amount of exposure. If you were wearing a smartwatch, the wrist would be the area of the body that would have the greatest exposure. If you were wearing smart glasses, it would be your eyes, and AirPods would deliver the greatest exposure to the middle ear, inner ear, and brain. Keep in mind that with some devices, and in particular cell phones, if the unit is connecting with a nearby antenna, the intensity of the radiation coming from the phone will be much less than if it were trying to connect with a faraway antenna or a satellite. Similarly, if a Bluetooth device like AirPods is connecting to a nearby cell phone, the intensity of the radiation coming from those wearables is going to be much less, but it will be right next to your brain. When you're exposed to a source of radiation that is further away, such as a cell phone mast or tower, you are receiving a whole body exposure. Keep in mind that even though the distance of the mast may be much further than the wearable Bluetooth device, it may be exposing you to even more radiation. It depends on the intensity of the radiation being emitted by the tower. But for a given intensity, if you double your distance from the source of radiation, your exposure will drop by 3/4, and that's known as the inverse square law. I mentioned earlier that until relatively recently, we have not been exposed to high intensities of electromagnetic fields and radiofrequency radiation in the natural world. As such, we have not developed any sort of protective mechanism to prevent these forms of radiation from penetrating into our body. In this graphic, which was provided to me by Professor Chamberlain, who you're going to hear from next, you can get a sense of what happens when these forms of radiation interact with the skin surface or any form of matter for that sense. The wave is partially reflected and partially absorbed. You can see that the intensity of the radiation diminishes as the radiation gets deeper and deeper into the body. The depth of penetration, as it is called, varies depending on the frequency and wavelength of the radiation. So higher frequencies penetrate less than lower frequencies. Our bodies have been designed to protect us from excessive heating from the sun's rays. We have a chemical compound in our skin called melanin, which absorbs light frequencies and diffuses their energy back into the environment in a form of infrared energy. In this way, our body temperatures can be maintained in the sunlight, but that system can be overridden. Now take a look at these two images on the right. The image of the finger labeled A is a normal view of the finger in daylight or any sort of ambient light. But if we put a very high intense light underneath the finger, the light radiation can actually penetrate through the entire digit and come out the other side, and that's why the finger looks like it's glowing on this image. With radiofrequency radiation, we're talking about lower frequencies that can penetrate much deeper than light. Unlike light, lower frequencies of EMR can penetrate through the walls and other objects, in addition to reflect off the walls and become absorbed. The radiation emits in every direction at once, like a light bulb, and creates an inhomogeneous cloud of energy. Let me see if I can get that to... It produces a cloud, and as you can see, it penetrates through the walls and the ceiling. We know this is true because when we turn on our laptop and we're looking for a connection, we can be connected to our neighbor's Wi-Fi. So what happens to the cells in our body when they are energized by this radiation? Several observations have been observed scientifically. For one, there is a membrane depolarization effect, which can lead to the activation of ion channels. Calcium channels in particular have been observed to open, and this allows for the influx of calcium into the cell, causing an imbalance and stressful condition. Cells exposed to EMFs have been shown to become stressed out. The technical term is called oxidative stress. What does this mean? It means that the cells exposed to EMFs produce a group of compounds called reactive oxygen species. These are unstable compounds that are reactive because they are looking for electrons so they can become more stable. Oxidative stress is a nonspecific cellular reaction that can occur from all sorts of stressful conditions and toxin exposures. And indeed, it does happen under normal circumstances as in addition, but the cell has mechanisms to combat this and neutralize the reactive oxygen species if they're not overly abundant. Regardless, EMFs have reportedly been shown to be a source of this cellular chaos. Researchers have evidence that oxidative stress is a result of increased intracellular calcium, but it may also be occurring through the interference of the energy and the passage of electrons and protons in the electron transport train in mitochondria, a process which is constantly employed to produce cellular energy currency called adenosine triphosphate. And this was just written up in a paper by Paul Heroux, which was very well written, and I recommend taking a look at it. When cells undergo stress, unfortunate things can happen. Membranes which protect the cell and control the cell's internal environment can become the source of electrons and become damaged, which causes the cell to lose its ability to function and can actually put the cell's life at risk. Proteins in a stressed out cell can become damaged and denatured. This may sound esoteric, but consider that many diseases now common in our population, like Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, and amyloidosis, are all associated with protein denaturation. Importantly, when a cell is stressed, its DNA can become damaged, as Dr. Davis mentioned. This can lead to mutations and possibly cause cancer. The cell's mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, can also become damaged and produce less energy and run less efficiently. You can imagine that if one continues to eat the same amount of food every day, but his or her cells can't use that food as efficiently, they will convert the excess food into fat and gain weight. Although the process of oxidative stress is not unique to EMFs, a few things do differentiate the effects of EMFs from other toxins. And this is important to understand. Perhaps the most important is that radiation only affects cells that are directly exposed to the radiation. This is different from, say, ingesting a toxin which then circulates through the bloodstream and gets disseminated throughout the whole body. If you wear earbuds, your ear and brain will be exposed, but your abdominal organs will have much less exposure. Most cells in the body are static, but not blood cells and cells of the immune system. These cells travel throughout the body and can therefore be exposed in the head and neck, and then travel anywhere and everywhere, having their effect at a distant site. Another important consideration that differentiates radiation from other sources of toxicity is that radiation doesn't respect tissue boundaries. You may have heard of the blood-brain barrier, for instance. This is a protective boundary designed to prevent toxins in the bloodstream from getting into the brain. Radiation goes right through this barrier. In general, it seems that the superficial structures in the body are at greatest risk for cellular oxidative stress from EMF exposure, particularly for higher frequencies. And we're going to take a look at the most common organs, and those include the breast, thyroid, testes, colon, and the brain. I mentioned that EMFs can cause cellular membranes to depolarize. When this happens to red blood cells, they can become sticky to one another and form chains or aggregates called rouleau formation. These slides were shared to me by Dr. Magda Havas, who is also speaking at this online seminar, and perhaps she will also present these slides to you. These two images were obtained utilizing a technique called dark field microscopy. In the left image, obtained prior to radiation exposure, a subject's blood was collected and placed on a slide. The image provided on the left shows a normal distribution of red blood cells. After the same person was exposed to a 2.45 gigahertz Wi-Fi router for 10 minutes only, their blood was again collected and placed on a slide, but this time the cells were stuck to one another, forming long chains. The same phenomenon can be observed with diagnostic ultrasound. These are images from a scientific paper I recently published in the journal Frontiers in Cardiovascular Medicine. With ultrasound, you are using high frequencies of sound to generate an image. The sound waves bounce off tissue interfaces in the body and produce an echo. The object the sound hits needs to be of a certain size in order to produce that echo. Based on the frequency of the transducer we used, the smallest objects that can be detected with the ultrasound are 154 microns. Why is that important? I want you to know that the red blood cell thickness is only 2 microns. So in a normal situation, which is this video here on the left, I'm going to show you what's called a cine clip. You can see that the interior of the vessel, which is the dark black band going across the image, it's a little jumpy, but you can get the idea. There's no echoes inside the lumen, except for some artifact along the upper part of the vessel. But after we expose the same person to a cell phone, we put a cell phone against her leg for 5 minutes and then repeated the study, you can see that the interior of the vessel now has all these little white dots within it. And each one of those white dots represents a cluster or an aggregation of red blood cells. It's an abnormal state. As I mentioned, it's called rouleau formation. This may look strange, but the health implications are much more concerning. When red blood cells are in rouleau, they don't function as efficiently, and gas exchange can be compromised. This could have significant consequences for one's overall energy level and metabolism. In addition, the condition can increase one's risk for developing a blood clot and other sequelae. Yeah, the images aren't coming out too well. Immune cells, which also travel through the blood and the lymph system, are incredibly important for our health and ability to fend off infections and keep tumors from developing. Many research studies have shown that exposure to EMFs can affect many different cell lines in the immune system. Here's a list of some of these studies. In general, it seems that short-term exposures can cause the immune system to go into action as if the body is trying to defend itself from being attacked. But as the exposure becomes chronic, the immune system becomes tired out and weakened. In the psychiatric field, they call that learned helplessness. Perhaps one of the most distressing observations has been the association of radiofrequency radiation exposure with breast cancer development. It is no secret that the number of women diagnosed with breast cancer continues to rise and has done so for the past 30 years. It is a terrible situation. And although there are many toxic chemicals in the environment, such as xenoestrogens, oxidative stress in the breast tissue caused by EMFs is likely one of these contributing environmental toxins. Please, if you know someone or if you yourself carry a cell phone in your bra, please, it's not safe to do so when you are increasing your risk for developing breast cancer. The thyroid gland is an endocrine gland that produces hormones that have a wide-ranging impact on the body. The gland is extremely radiosensitive because it is so superficial. Although more research is needed to better understand the total impact, it is clear that exposure to radiofrequency radiation can cause thyroid dysfunction and thyroid cancer, particularly in some genetically susceptible populations. As with the immune system, it appears that acute exposure can cause increased function and hyperstimulation, whereas chronic exposure can lead to decreased function. The parathyroid glands are located right next to the thyroid gland and are also likely affected by this radiation. And I've known 2 people in the recent past who developed parathyroid adenomas and hypercalcemia, which is usually very unusual. It's a rare tumor. But thyroid, it's important to understand that thyroid hormone and the thyroid function overlaps with the immune system. So if you impact the thyroid gland, you are indirectly affecting your immune system. Thyroid dysfunction can also affect the heart rhythm and lead to arrhythmias, and it can affect overall metabolism and lead to weight gain or weight loss. If you're keeping a cell phone in your pocket and you're trying to have children, or if you want to have a sufficient amount of testosterone in your body, it's probably not a good idea. The testicles are another important superficial structure at risk with exposure to radiofrequency radiation. Studies have shown that the radiation can cause a heating effect, and you are probably aware that the testicles hang low in the scrotum because they need to be at a lower temperature than the body. They're very sensitive to heat, and therefore heating effects from the cell phone are of great concern. Research studies have also shown that RF causes oxidative stress and can affect sperm motility and viability. This is certainly important if you want to have children. The fastest sperm are the ones that reach the egg. Remember, survival of the fittest. You have more than likely heard that there has been a 4-fold increase in incidence in young adults in colorectal cancer. And this is also true in other industrialized nations, and this has been since 2010. Colorectal cancer cells are exquisitely sensitive to radiofrequency radiation. Now, colon cancer has traditionally been thought to be associated with exposure to a chemical compound called nitrosamines, which are produced when meat is processed with nitrates, such as bacon and ham. We may, however, now have another environmental toxin that is increasing our risk for colon cancer. You may think that the colon is deep in the body, and it is in some people, but the colon can also be very superficial, and it can be located just beneath the anterior abdominal wall. If you placed your cell phone and laptop on your stomach, you were giving a part of, or even parts of your colon, a hefty dose of radiation. And I just wanted to show you an image from a CAT scan. If you look at the upper part of this cross-sectional image through the body, you can see there's a fluid level with a dependent white portion that's contrast, and the black above it is gas, and that is in the transverse colon, and you can see it's only maybe a centimeter deep to the anterior abdominal wall. So if you put a cell phone or a laptop on that skin surface, it's very close proximity to the colon. I hope you don't still do this. When I walk down the street now, I'm happy to report that more and more people are holding their cell phone in front of them and using the speakerphone function. This is definitely advised. There has been a lot of research done with cell phone risk and brain cancer, and although there's hesitancy to come right out and say that there is an increased risk, many of us do believe that there is. And you do not want to have your cell phone right up to your head ever. And to drive home the point of the anatomy here, this is a slab of a brain through the middle of the head. And I'm presenting this gross image to you because I want to show you just how close the brain is to your ear. There's only a very thin membrane that separates your external ear canal from the middle ear, and then two additional membranes that separate your middle ear from the inner ear, where your cochlea and labyrinth are located. The labyrinth is important for maintaining equilibrium and balance. Is it really any wonder why cell phone radiation has reportedly caused ringing in the ears and dizziness in some people? Just beyond the inner ear is the brain. Now, this is a simulation that was given to me by Professor Chamberlain. In it, you can see the extent of radiation penetration throughout the brain when a cell phone is applied to the ear. Just keep in mind, this is a simulation, but it illustrates the complex absorption pattern and distribution of radiation in the brain. And this is because of the brain's complex anatomy and that of the skull. So when the cell phone is turned on, you can see the radiation transmission into the brain. Aside from the risk of brain cancer, there are more pervasive impacts on our society, and Dr. Davis touched on this. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, which recently caused quite a buzz worldwide. He correctly identified that cell phone radiation and electromagnetic media as being a deeply damaging technology for our children. The addictive impact of social media, which removes our attention from the real world and places it into a synthetic virtual world, has been catastrophic. But it's not just the screen time and social media content that is to blame. The RF exposure from devices most certainly is having a negative effect on our children's health. Increased exposure to RF has been shown to cause increased anxiety in animal studies and depression. RF causes confusion, cognitive fog, memory loss, and difficulty in concentration. And it has been shown that only 10,000 microwatts per meter squared, which is not much, can cause EEG changes in the brain. And then there's the impact on our sleep. Circadian rhythms and melatonin production can be affected by our exposure to RF radiation. Radiation exposures from Wi-Fi, cell phones, and other emitters can affect your melatonin production, and it is for this reason that it is best to take all electronics out of the bedroom while you're sleeping. And in addition, turn your Wi-Fi routers off and boosters off at night. Place all of these items on an appliance timer if you need to, but it's really, really important to turn it all off so that you preserve your melatonin production. Like thyroid hormone discussed earlier, melatonin is extremely important for your overall health. It has powerful antioxidant properties and is super important for keeping your body coherent. That is, with the circadian rhythms of the earth and other organisms, and also for keeping your immune system healthy. So what can I tell you about the safety of wireless communication? After all I've read, my impression is that the health impacts are very similar to ionizing radiation. All radiation can cause predictable effects, like tissue heating. Although non-ionizing radiation doesn't cause direct ionization, it can cause indirect ionization, which lead to random effects like the development of oxidative stress, which can then lead to cancer and other diseases. There is no way for me or anyone to tell you that a certain amount of technologically generated radiation is safe and won't have a potentially harmful effect on your body. All life forms on Earth produce radiation as a method of intracellular communication, and even tiny intensities of EMF at various frequencies have been shown to cause confusion in intracellular communication. Therefore, my recommendation is to limit your exposure to wireless communication and all forms of anthropomorphic radiation as much as reasonably achievable. In the radiology world, we call this ALARA. We can't live in a world without technology, but we can use it sparingly, and when we don't need it, we should turn it off. And with that, I will now lead you to Professor Ken Chamberlain.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Davis. Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you to the conference organizers. I'm assuming that you can hear me now. Thumbs
Yes.
up if you can. Fantastic. So the journey that brings me here today started about 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire, as you heard in the introduction. And I didn't think that wireless radiation was a problem, which is kind of surprising because my specialty area was radio frequency engineering and biomedical engineering. But that was my belief, and I can explain why that was. You know, we would get periodic updates about the non-harm of wireless radiation from our professional organization, IEEE, and they would come out on a regular basis. And so I dutifully read those articles and thought, man, there's not a problem here. And so when I was invited to serve on a state commission, uh, when I was asked to serve on a state commission to explore the health and environmental impacts of wireless radiation, well, I thought this isn't going to take long, but I soon found out otherwise. And so what I'd like to do is share some of my journey with you and then let you know how our commission came to the conclusions it came to. So it's time for me now to start my screen sharing. This is always the awkward time of a presentation. And so now I'm assuming that you can see my screen.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about today will be how wireless radiation guidelines were set. So I'm starting with something that was pretty impactful for us on the commission. Once we found out how those guidelines were set, a lot of pieces of the puzzle came together, and that's what I'll be sharing with you. And I think that if there's anything you need to know about wireless radiation exposure, well, it's how the radiation guidelines were set. And then what the peer-reviewed science is. It seems to be one of the main questions I get, and that is, what proves to you and what convinced the commission, the New Hampshire commission I served on, what convinced you that there was a problem? And were you basing that on rock solid information? So I'm going to go through that with you, not in an exhaustive way, but just to let you know what we looked at, how we looked at it, and how we came to the conclusions. And this is not only going to include, in a very brief way, because I don't have much time to talk about this, but it's going to talk about things that I've learned since serving on the commission. And there's a lot. There seems to be articles coming out on a daily basis that show that and reinforce the findings of the New Hampshire Commission. And then answering a question about how much of the signal do you actually need to have a robust phone call, a video call, or to watch YouTube videos, for example? Do you need a very powerful, strong signal? Do you need a tower in your backyard? Well, the answer is no, but we'll be looking at that as well and give you actual numbers about what it takes. And then how the regulatory bodies, the FCC, the EPA, the FDA, what are they doing to protect us? And why aren't they protecting us? Why are they being undermined? So before I go into this, I should also note that not only did I not believe that there was a problem with wireless radiation, but I would give this, say that, to say why I didn't feel like there was a problem to groups of people. I would give presentations as a department chair. And so came kind of as a shock to me when I did find out the harms of wireless radiation. But having said that, let's jump right in to the material and go into how the guidelines were set. And the guidelines were actually set in the Telecommunications Act, Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act, but they were determined. The experiments were performed in the 1980s, and they were based upon short-term less than an hour studies of behavioral study on 8 rats and 5 monkeys, as pictured there. And what's amazing, in just starting off here, is that the guidelines that were set for the thresholds in the radiation that we can be exposed to today only lasted for 1 hour or less. Yet we're being exposed 24/7. And the way their thinking was, and the reason they chose that to the short time limit, to short time frame, is that they were working under the assumption that if a wireless radiation isn't strong enough to warm you up, well, then it's not going to be harmful. Now, we know that radiation can warm you up, can warm things up, as we know from putting foods in the microwave oven. But that's really high levels of exposure. And then that definitely would be dangerous. But what they're assuming is that if it's less than that, if it's not warming you up, it is not harmful at all. So the way the experiment worked to determine the thresholds that are in place today was that they put animals, these were 8 rats and the 5 monkeys, in a cage, not together. These experiments were done separately. And they had them be trained. These were trained animals, and they were trained to push a lever to get food, and they were food deprived at the beginning of the experiment. And so if they weren't exposed to wireless or radiation, they would simply continue pressing the lever until they got satiated, till they got their fill of food. But what happened is that they were exposed to increasing levels of radiation until they could no longer press the lever for food. And that was referred to, the level of radiation at which that occurred was referred to as the threshold dose. Now, that was a lot of radiation exposure. And in fact, some of the monkeys had burns on their faces from that very high level of radiation. But that was the level at which they could no longer perform their task. And so the experimenters said, that's it. Now, this is somewhat shocking that they would go to that level of radiation exposure, because we know that if we exposed a human to that, that would be really, really damaging. And then what they did to come up with the amount of radiation that we're allowed to be exposed to today, they simply took that very high dosage of exposure, that threshold dose, they divided it by an arbitrary number, and that number was 50, to come up with the exposures that we can be that are allowable today. Now, what's important, and the reason you need to know this is, first of all, it's kind of ridiculous how they set those standards, because what we're finding, and as has been reported earlier by other presenters, is that it's the long-term effect. As an example, if we were asked to smoke a pack of cigarettes within an hour, we would all survive. But the way these experiments were done, if they were trying to look at ways of approving or disapproving cigarettes, they would say, well, they smoked a pack of cigarettes and within an hour and they survived. Well, cigarette smoking must be safe. But we know that with cigarettes, it's the long-term effect that's of greatest concern, because most of us could tolerate smoking a pack of cigarettes. I should also note that safety factor that they divided by, that very high level of exposure, they divided it by 10 for workers. And this is not typical. This is not what's done and what has not been done with other toxins or toxicants. For example, with the chemical industry, you put in a safety factor of 1,000 or more, and you shoot for a targeted level of risk, a confidence interval, with a certain confidence interval. But that's not what happened here. And we'll get into why the industry wants to have these very high exposure limits in just a moment. Now, I mentioned that this is a long-term effect, and I'd like to show you and give you a sense of how long, what type of term we're looking at. Are cell phones a death ray? Do they put out a death ray? Well, the answer is no, but they do act on you in a very slow manner. Now, this comes from the same study that Dr. Davis talked about. And the reason I'm representing this information, because it gives you a sense of time. So notice here that back in 2008, you have a mast here, and then 465 feet away from it, you have a tree. And then over time, with exposure, that tree begins to degrade. So 7 years after it was exposed to the radiation, you can see that the left side of the tree starts to degrade. And then if you give it another 4 years, they had to chop the tree down. And this is not a one-off situation. It has been reported, it looked at over 100 trees. Now, not all species react the same way to radiation exposure, but all trees are degraded. And this is just a chance to look at it and to give you a sense of how the radiation exposure works over time. And a key point is, and I circled this in red here, is the amount of radiation it takes to bring about the type of degradation that you're looking at in this figure. For example, the left side of the tree is only 0.03% of the FCC limit. And so why this is important is that when the people from telecom come out and they say, well, we want to put in a tower and your exposure is only going to be, some very small amount, and it's only a very small percentage of the FCC limit, that's really meaningless because you can see what type of damage that type of exposure causes over time. So now I'm going to get into the New Hampshire Commission I served on, and I think it's just important that you see that what I'm telling you comes from a very solid source. I'm not just telling you my opinion. I'm telling you this citizen to citizen. I'm not getting paid by anyone to make these statements. I'm simply speaking to you as a representative of this commission that I served on. And the first thing you might want to know is, well, why was the commission formed in the first place? And the answer is that legislators were being told by their constituents that they were being harmed by wireless radiation. And yet these same legislators were being told by industry, the wireless industry, well, no, the wireless radiation exposure is totally harmless, and you need to deploy more infrastructure in your state to stay economically competitive. So if you're a legislator who's dealing with thousands of bills, of pieces of legislation per year, what do you do to answer kind of tricky questions like this? Well, you form a commission. And that's what somebody did. One of the representatives and senators came up with this legislation. It was bipartisan because this is a bipartisan issue. And so what they wanted to do and what they did with this legislation is they formed a commission. And in the end, we ended up with 13 members on the commission. I was asked to join because of my background in electromagnetics and biomedical engineering. And in the end, we had 13 members, and we had people with the right expertise. For example, we had people with backgrounds in medicine, physics, toxicology. You can read it on the slide. Electromagnetics, that was me. Epidemiology, biostatistics, occupational health. So we had the right expertise. These are unbiased people because none of us were getting paid to be there. And we just served because we wanted to be good citizens. So, but we did have the expertise to answer the questions that were being asked of us. And some of those questions, well, why does the insurance industry recognize wireless radiation as a risk, but won't insure against damages caused by it? Not even Lloyd's of London. That really got legislators' attention. And I think that's one reason that they supported this bill so as they did. They wanted to get the answer to this. And why haven't the hundreds, and I say now thousands of peer-reviewed journals show harm, but those articles that show harm are completely ignored by the Federal Communications Commission? And why are those guidelines, the ones that I just told you about, why are they based only on heating effects? Why don't they look at long-term effects? And finally, did the World Health Organization classify wireless radiation as a possible human carcinogen? That's in the same category as lead and DDT. And yet that was completely ignored by the FCC and has continued to be ignored by the FCC. Just here's something brief. I mean, there's a lot of things I could show that let you know that the insurance industry won't touch this because they learned their lesson with asbestos. And so, it was one of those hidden situations where they didn't expect there to be a problem, but all of a sudden people discovered that wireless or that exposure to asbestos caused nasty things like mesothelioma. So the sources of information, our commission met for over a year, and the sources of information that we used were, as you'd expect, peer-reviewed and commission-vetted publications. And the reason I include commission-vetted is that I think everybody listening understands that that not everything published in peer-reviewed journals is correct or accurate. There are fringe journals out there that publish almost anything. So what we did as the commission, and I was a big part of that because of my background in vetting publication as a department chair and an associate editor. So we did a vetting a process for any of the articles that we used to draw our conclusions. I worked with our college librarian who has a Ph.D. in library sciences. To answer the question is this a reliable source of information? And so everything that I'm going to tell you about the findings of the commission was very thoroughly vetted before we used the information to draw our conclusions. We also, sources of information, regulatory agencies. That was one of the first things we did, besides the launch of the peer-reviewed journal publications. But we invited the Federal Communications Commission to meet with us either virtually or in person. We invited them to this formal state commission. We invited the Food and Drug Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency. But in the final analysis, none of them came to meet with us. Now, why I'm listing this with the sources of information when they didn't even come is the fact that they didn't come was a very important piece of information, and you'll see why that is later on in my presentation. We also brought in outside experts, recognized experts, nationally and internationally recognized experts with expertise in the relationship between exposure to electromagnetic fields and health. And all of them provided clear evidence that wireless radiation poses a threat, except for one of them. And so the one presenter who said, oh no, wireless radiation is totally harmless, was the one presenter who was brought in by the telecom industry, and it was the only presenter or the only outside expert that was paid to speak to us. Now there's a trend there. I don't mean to vilify anybody, because remember, I said at the beginning that I didn't believe that wireless radiation was a problem myself in the beginning. But the information's out there, so anybody who wants to learn about the harms of wireless radiation, it's out there. And I'll make the claim that any independent group that looks at the effects and starts looking through the peer-reviewed journals will come to the same conclusion that the New Hampshire Commission came to. So here's what we came up with the peer-reviewed literature search, and it was reinforced by the outside experts that we brought in, and that is that we identified hundreds of top-tier publications that showed harm from low-level wireless radiation. That's that's basically it. Can't say much more than that. And the vast majority of peer-reviewed publications showed effects from exposure. Now, the reason these two bullets are important is that on many occasions, I have heard people from telecommunication companies make the statement that the only peer-reviewed journals articles that show harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. Well, the second article, the second bullet here, shows that we didn't need to cherry pick. It was the vast majority that showed problem. The preponderance of data shows that there's a problem with wireless radiation exposure. And they weren't from fringe journals because we didn't use fringe journals. We went through the systematic review to only use reliable journal sources, high quality, top tier journal sources to draw our conclusions. Now, where this the harm that was shown, and this relates to the previous two speakers, Dr. Brown, Dr. Davis, is that the 91% of the studies that looked at free radical or oxidative stress is a result of exposure to low-level wireless radiation. And when I say low-level exposure, RFR is radio frequency radiation. That's the type of radiation you get from your own cell phone or from living near a tower. Now, the previous speakers did talk about oxidative stress. I'm assuming that you don't need to hear it again from me, but the primary mechanism, as noted in the previous slide, where there is a shown and a demonstrated association between exposure and the development of free radicals, that is oxidative stress, can be related to these diseases that are shown here. You know, the sperm damage and infertility, neurodegenerative diseases, cancer. So you have heard this probably a number of times now. So it's well known that association between exposure to low-level wireless radiation and oxidative stress and its association with the diseases shown on this slide is very well known. It's not like it's being debated. It shows up, this association, it shows up in a preponderance of the data. I could just put it right here is, you know, the multiple impacts of the oxidative stress of reactive oxygen species is shown here. I'm stepping a little bit out of my lane here. Remember, I am an electrical engineer, although I work in biomedical engineering, I don't do much of this, but I do recognize that, and I recognize from reading many of these articles that exposure to wireless radiation, and I could talk more about that, you know, how it happens at the end of the electron transport chain, a very delicate process, and if you expose it to electromagnetic fields, it makes that process less efficient, and it causes the body, the mitochondria, to produce less or more free radicals, but as Dr. Brown talked about. So I'm not going to go into that too much detail. Another thing that is important when you're talking about science, and that is a report that came out a long time ago, and that is called the Reflex Report. And you can Google it. It's readily available, and it shows here what happens with the Comet assay for a control DNA cell looks like. This is something like electrophoresis, and it's called single cell electrophoresis. So if you put in a cell of DNA and you run it through the process for Comet assay, it's nice and symmetric. But if you expose it to something that we know causes harm, and in this case, that's ionizing gamma radiation, which is, it was exposed to an amount equivalent to 1,600 chest X-rays, which is a pretty heavy dose, well, you get the expected degradation in the cell. But what happens if you expose a cell to wireless radiation, like a cell phone? You get the same type of degradation. So if you hear the claim by telecom that, well, no, non-ionizing radiation can't cause an effect, can't impact a cell like that, you know, as an ionizing radiation can, there's clear evidence that it does. Ionizing radiation, cell phone radiation, does impact cells, does impact your DNA in the same way as does ionizing radiation. So just to kind of reinforce that, I've given you the view from, the microscopic view and then given the broader view. And I want to talk now about a study that was done, and then I'll talk about other studies that followed on that reinforced this study I'm about to tell you about, is it looked at death rates from cancer versus the distance people live from cell towers. And this is the reason I'm feeling like this is an important thing to show you, because it's a question that we had to answer in the commission. How far is safe or reasonable to live from a cell phone, a cell phone tower? And this report gives you some pretty good insights into that. And it was, and if you want to read it, you can look it up. And it explored the relationship between cancer deaths and the distance people live from cell towers. And this was taken from government databases. You know, you can easily look up, or I shouldn't say easily, but you can look up in the databases, you know, when people died, what they died from, where they lived, and how far they were from a cell tower. And the thing that I like about this study, or one of the things, a couple of things, is they looked at a large number of deaths. It's not like a study that looked at only a small number of deaths, but this is over 7,000 cancer deaths and a large number of cell towers. So if you're involved in and you're familiar with statistical analyses, you'll know that this had a lot of statistics, things that statisticians like in terms of having a large number. And it was performed when very few people in Brazil had their own cell phones. This was between 1996 and 2006. In fact, it wasn't until 2010 when only about a quarter of the people had their own cell phones. So the reason that's important is that we're not looking at the effects of people's own electronics. We were looking at the effects of people living near a cell tower. So the result of this, or the findings of the study, can be shown in one slide, and this is it right here, where the blue line on the bottom, the straight line, represents the cancer death rate for the population in general, and the red trace is for people participating in the study, which are people who died, I should say, who died while living next to or within 1 kilometer of a cell tower. And what's convincing here is, first of all, that you have a monotonic decline suggesting a dose-dependent relationship between exposure and the death rate. And you can see that it asymptotes. That red line asymptotes to the population, the death rate for the population in general, as you get far enough away from the tower. So what's a safe distance, a reasonable distance to live from a cell tower? We had picked, and a number of people have picked, 500 meters. Still not, you're not going to have the same death rate as for the population in general, but it seemed reasonable. And reasonable is a term that we need to keep in mind as we make recommendations, because if you say that you have to, be 5 miles away from a cell tower, that's not reasonable in terms of providing people with the communication that they now demand. So just want to say that that was not just a one-off study. When you take a look at a meta-study that looked at results from, in this case, 38 previous studies, they come up with very similar conclusions to what they came up with in the Brazilian study. And that is that if you're within 500 meters of a cell tower, you're going to have increased negative health consequences compared to those who are living farther from a cell tower. And this, I haven't even updated this, there are probably 50 similar studies right now. I just wanted to show this because this is also a question that I get a lot, and that is, how do our limits, the limits for exposure in the United States, compare with other countries? And not all that well. But the main point that I want to make here is, if this were a scientific question, about what exposure limits are reasonable, what are safe from a health standpoint, if it were really a scientific answer, all of these would be the same. There would be a conference, and the scientists would get together and say, okay, well, the right answer is X, and everybody would adopt that. But in this case, the fact that you have this variability from country to country suggests that this is a political question, not a scientific one. Something else I promised I would tell you, and that is, what signal do you need? How much of a signal to have robust communication? I'm talking voice and communication, watching your YouTube videos. So this is an example from a school parking lot where they had put up a tower and parents were concerned. So I loaned one of the parents my meter, and what you can see here is this 80,800. That is the exposure from this cell tower that you're looking at on the right. At that location. And it's where kids play, it's where parents wait in line. And so do you need that type of exposure in order to have a robust phone call? Well, here's the answer. If you want a great signal, that's 4 to 5 bars, you need 6 microwatts per meter squared, which, when you look at the units here you're receiving 80,000 microwatts, and you only need 6 for a very strong signal of 5 bars. But that puts you in the extreme level of radiation exposure. If you want to have just a good signal, you only need 6 nanowatts per meter squared. That's 10 to the minus 9th. That wouldn't show up on this meter right here. And finally, I should say that my iPhone SE, and I just got an iPhone 16. I was forced to get it because they're no longer supporting my SE. I got fine downloads with only 2 bars. So my point here, and what is I want you to keep in mind, is that you only need a minuscule signal to get robust phone service. And the reason they want to be able to expose people to greater levels of exposure is for money. And that's probably not surprising anybody. The easiest and the lowest cost way to provide coverage is to put in an antenna, crank up the power to the maximum allowed, and you're going to get great coverage from that single antenna, but you're also going to be providing excessive radiation for people nearby. The point is, you don't need to have cell towers on or near schools. And it's been shown, is shown right here, that it does exposure to wireless radiation has an impact on people's learning, their cognitive health. And so if you're living near a cell phone tower, it does impact your gross motor skills, spatial working memory, and attention. And so this is all linked. There's here, uh, and it demonstrates it. And you definitely don't want to, and I know that I'm repeating things that you've already heard, but this is really important for people to hear. Sometimes kids go to bed holding their cell phone. Or another thing that happens is people go to sleep with the cell phones on their nightstand. That's probably the most common. And something I should point out now is that by having a cell phone, you think that, oh, I'm not using my cell phone, it's not radiating. That's not the case. Your cell phone is almost constantly talking back and forth with the cell tower with what's called handshake commands. And that's significant radiation. And it's the type of radiation that can keep you up at night and provide you with insomnia. So definitely make sure, as Dr. Brown emphasized, not to expose yourself to radiation at night. Memory damage, and it's just more of the same. This RF radio frequency, electromagnetic field brain doses for each participant showed that longer phone associated with impaired memory. So what was it I was saying? Oh, just kidding. So just keep that in mind that all of these things that I'm talking about have been well documented, and it reinforces what you've heard from Dr. Davis and Dr. Brown. So the question that should be popping up in your heads right now, and that is, how come our federal agencies are not protecting us? And so what role do regulatory agencies play? And if you look at the what's on the slide here, it says captured agency, how the Federal Communications Commission is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. Now, this is not from some extremist website. It is from the Harvard University Center for Ethics. And it shows that industry controls the FCC. And you can read it right there. And so what they've done is they've got this revolving door, which is what is pictured in the graphic. And so the people who are working for the FCC go to work for industry and they come back out again. And so the industry keeps their own people in leadership roles within these agencies. And so the agencies will never change their way, never change the regulations in a way that is not beneficial to industry. And as I mentioned, it would cost industry more to comply with more reasonable radiation thresholds. And so they just do what they can to keep the levels high, the radiation exposure levels high. So that same report that I just mentioned, they're using the same playbook as Big Tobacco did, and they get this big war chest. And note here that they're spending over $100 million a year on lobbying. I could go into far greater detail there, and they are using the same playbook as Big Tobacco. And if anybody's watched the video, was thank you for smoking. You can see in the end of that video, they go from the people who are promoting tobacco smoking, then go to promoting cell phones. It's a good video to watch, whether or not your feelings are about the topic that I'm presenting. So they're following the same playbook. They've got lots of money. They're, providing contributions to politicians, and it's the same thing that we've seen before. As I mentioned, asbestos, causes mesothelioma, but we knew that back in the 1890s. It took us 100 years to ban it. And so here you see that if, cigarettes do not cause cancer, Well, it has to do with money. I mean, we now know that it does cause cancer. So how are they able to do that? How are they able to come out with these reports? Well, like I say, you have enough money, you can get people to say anything, and you can get this result right here. Here's tobacco institutes with a lot of the dead bodies behind them saying, prove it. Now, arguably, only 1 out of 6 lifetime smokers dies with lung cancer or contracts lung cancer. 1 out of 6. So, have we really proven that smoking causes lung cancer? Now, if you don't have much insight or background in statistics, you might say, well, they haven't proven it. Only 1 out of 6. And what would it take? 6 out of 6? Well, that's some people's thinking, with some people's thinking, that would be the case. So, what are we trying for at the environmental health? What would we like to see happen? We would like to get companies to compete on safety. To anybody that has studied this, the science is crystal clear. Wireless radiation does cause harm, and it should be regulated more effectively. But just like the auto industry fought safety measures back in the 1950s and 60s, and safety measures, I'm talking about padded dashboards, safety glass, seat belts, airbags. Every one of those was fought by the auto industry. Now, we're very glad to have them today. And what we would like to see, and also companies are competing on that basis. Our cars are safer. I've had my Volvos, and they are safer. So we want to see industry do the same thing. At the end, and I noticed that I'm coming close to the end of my time, but I think I have a little bit time left. If you let me know if I'm getting close to the end, please.
You can go as long as you need to go.
Fantastic. So here's a question that we came up with in the commission, and that is, why is telecom pushing so hard to roll out more infrastructure? It's putting a lot of pressure in places where there's great cell phone coverage. You can make a call, no problem. Why are they pushing for more, and more? Well, the answer is this. Well, this is a part of the answer. And that is, we look at the way most of us are connected to the internet today. This is how I'm connected right now. And that is, we have fiber optics or cable running to every house. And it's happening in every house in my neighborhood. And so, we had this since the 1990s. And so that's what we have today. But what the wireless industry wants is they want to be able to have us get our internet from a local wireless facility, whether it's 5G or 4G. And so they're going to take the connections out of our houses, hook them up to antennas, or maybe use existing antennas, and then sell us these devices that perhaps you're familiar with. They're referred to as home internet, wireless home internet. And we went to my local Verizon store the other day, and sure enough, they're advertising it, and they have these cute little boxes. You take them home, you plug them in, and you have wireless internet. You have Wi-Fi in your home. You don't have to go through your cable guy anymore. And that it's more convenient. And right now, it looks to be, or they're making it appear to be less expensive. Well, you don't have to deal with that cable guy anymore. And that's more convenient, certainly. But what that does is it gives industry a monopoly. And it also makes us a lot more vulnerable. Vulnerable because we're having greater exposure to wireless radiation. And there's some other vulnerabilities I'll point out right here. Far greater exposure to wireless radiation, and you can't opt out from that. So if the industry gets its way and puts a cell tower right outside your home, you can't opt out of that. I know people who have tried, and they just say, nope, we're not going to take it out. I'm talking about 4G and 5G. And I did some work, I did research for the Department of Justice, and the reason one thing I was asked to look at were the vulnerabilities of cellular communication. Because in an emergency situation, what does everybody do? They grab their cell phone. The cell towers saturate, and people can't place cell calls. That's a vulnerability. And also, they can be jammed. I can say something more about that in the next slide. And this monopoly I mentioned. It gives you, when you have a monopoly on people's internet and their phone, you can do whatever you want. And we all know that you don't get any really savings by going from one provider to another. They've got monopolies. Uh, and I'll say more about the jamming in a moment. The also, and I'm kind of jumping a little bit of a non sequitur here. I apologize, but I also wanted to say that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation said that exposure limits, when tested against the body, are greater than what they had been reporting and did violate the laws. And this was published when the Environmental Health Trust was involved in getting this information, as Dr. Davis mentioned in her presentation, to show that the way the cell radiation from our phones is measured incorrectly. It was measured incorrectly to give false results, and the FCC knew about this. And so you can read about that in the Chicago Tribune, and the FCC secretly confirmed in 2019 that phones exceeded the 1996 guidelines. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this because we're getting into a little bit more out of my line when we're getting to the legal things, but I do want to have it in my presentation because our commission was aware of some of these things. In conclusion, the commission I served on came up with its final report in 2020, November 2020, and its findings were that wireless radiation, which includes 5G and Wi-Fi, poses a significant threat to human health and the environment. The electromagnetic radiation syndrome, that's where people are hypersensitive to exposures. They can't be in a room with an operating cell phone or a Wi-Fi. They just can't be there because of their sensitivity, not dissimilar from other sensitivities that we're aware of, like peanut sensitivities, but in this case is caused by exposure to electromagnetic fields. Industry will claim, oh, that's all in their head, it's totally psychosomatic, but what we found is that it is very much real. Wireless communication is not nearly as secure. This is not solely a scientific issue, but it's a political and economic one as well. So concluding remarks, a series of unbiased experts, including the New Hampshire Commission, concluded that low-level wireless radiation is harmful to the human health and the environment. And there's a lot that could be done to reduce exposures, and that's something I really didn't get into because I can tell you that once we accept the fact, and once industry recognizes the fact that wireless radiation is harmful, we can do something about it. But as long as they continue to deny it, we're really kind of hamstrung. So that's what we're hoping to achieve by presentations like the ones we're giving today. And if you're in a position to do so, if you're a regular legislator, town council, and a school board, do whatever you can to prevent the radiation sources from overly exposing your students, your community, your constituents. And finally, just how to take action, get informed, speak at public meetings, organize coalitions. And then a little plug for our organization is contact us at EH Trust. There's a lot you can do in working with our organizations like ours to make meaningful change. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all three speakers. And I appreciate all the information that you shared. So I know you shared your screen on how people could get involved. If they want to follow each of your work, there's three of you, so you can go one at a time. We can go in the order of that you spoke in. If they want to follow your work or get in touch with you, how would they best be able to do so? We can start with Devra Davis.
Would you like me to try to answer some of the questions in the chat? What is the general approach here?
Yeah, I can go through the chat. If you want to read them yourself, you can go through them and answer the ones that you want to answer. That'd be great.
Well, there's a question about what we can expect from Robert Kennedy Jr., and I think the answer is it all depends on what he'll be allowed to do, because there is a contradiction inherent in the Trump cabinet. You have Robert Kennedy Secretary of HHS, Health and Human Services, who wants to improve the food supply, who is aware of the dangers of wireless radiation. And at the same time, you've got other members of the same cabinet that want to promote the industrialization of agriculture and the continued changes in public education. What Dr. Chamberlain did not mention to you is that he's also been and is currently head of a school board. So he understands the practical challenges that school boards face. And an Environmental Health Trust has a whole section of materials on why and how schools, number one, do not need wireless, and number two, how they can install systems that are wired. And there have been a number of groups that have reported and commented on how to do this. As to how bad is Starlink, again, I think that I'll let Professor Chamberlain, our president, answer that question. But distance is the big issue, right? And if you think about the strength of the signal required to get thousands of miles, it's really a challenge to the world to figure out how do we allow people to be better connected without exposing them to levels that can be dangerous. And the short answer is we can't. There's a trade-off that has to be acknowledged here. I want to just thank my colleagues because they are the new leaders of this organization. And as you continue to stay informed, please do go to our website, which is in fact a work under development right now. We are revising the website to enhance your ability to get information from it. And I would clarify that I see that Odette Wilkins, who's been involved in this, the case was that was won in the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals was in fact called Environmental Health Trust et al. Versus the FCC, and we initiated that case, Environmental Health Trust, and then the court ordered us to work with Mr. Kennedy, which we did to great success. And Scott McCullough was the attorney who argued the case for us very successfully. And we presented data. Remember, this is back in 2020. We presented over 11,000 pages of scientific evidence. And this is now 5 years later, 5 years later. And there has been no change in the FCC. And we're really delighted that Ms. Wilkins and others have been so effective at making the case for why we need to do more. And hopefully, Mr. Kennedy will be allowed to see things change, but it remains to be seen.
Did anyone else want to follow up?
Not with that particular comment, but I do have other comments to respond to people who have written into the chat.
Go ahead.
So there was the question about how to measure the fields in and around your home, and thank you, Odette, for answering. But there's something else I want to mention, and that is these meters are a little bit pricey, $400-ish. But we do have a program in the Environmental Health Trust that allows us to subsidize a meter so that local libraries can purchase them. And that's our intent, is so that we make these available at a lower cost to libraries. And so you can check these meters out like you would check out a book. And it just allows a lot of people to gain access and to get a better sense of what their exposures are. And that's really the best way. In fact, it's the only real good way of determining what your exposures are, is with a meter. And the Safe and Sound Pro 2 is a calibrated meter, and it's the one that I had pictured in one of my slides. It's easy to use and provides you a nice readout that you can then work with people like us to figure out what the results mean. But the little lights from green to red tell a pretty good story.
I can add to that. The meters provide three bits of information. One is a peak value, one's a maximum value, and one's the average value. And it's important to look at the maximum value because that's the most intense radiation that you're being exposed to. And you'll notice when you use these meters that the intensity fluctuates over time because that's the nature of the communication. It's sent out in pulsations. And depending on how you direct the detector, you're going to pick up different sources. It's a directional antenna. So you need to move around an environment holding the detector in different positions in order for you to pick up the different sources of radiation. So it's not like you get one number and then that's it. It's really a dynamic process. And the goal is to try to limit your exposure as much as possible. There are different shielding techniques, but the most effective thing is to turn off devices and increase your distance from those devices that you do have on.
I'd like to respond to another question.
Sure, go ahead.
And this is from Janet, and she's saying, how do you use your iPhone 16 safely? And there's a word there that's really hard to address, and that is safe. What is safe? For some people, no level is really good. And that's why they move to West Virginia in that quiet zone so they won't be exposed to any. But for most of us, you can, first of all, keep it in airplane mode when it's on your body. That's probably the main thing that you can do. And make sure that you have it turned off, everything turned off when you go to sleep at night and you have it on your bedstand. And you might say, well, I can't receive phone calls and I need to be available. Well, in that case, you can leave it off of airplane mode, but put it way away from you as far as you can within your room and still be able to hear it. So also a follow-on question is, what about these wireless headsets, the AirPods? Man, I can't say anything about a reasonable approach there because these headsets, they are using radio waves to get information for the music or whatever it is you're listening to, and they're talking to each other. So they're not only talking to your phone, these headsets are talking to each other. So you have radiation going directly through your brain. So I got to admit, my kids use them from time to time, but I think they use them less after I've had a little talking with them with them about it. I have heard of so many cases where people get headaches from using these headsets, the AirPods, and just take them out. So don't buy them as gifts. And that's where my kids wanted that as a gift. Well, hey, can we have AirPods for Christmas? No, no way. So discourage people from using them and don't use them yourself.
So on that subject, so one question that I've heard people have is the ones that are out of the ear versus the ones that are in your ear. And you're saying that it doesn't really matter because it's going through your head anyway.
Well, we want to do more modeling on this. And we do have models that we could bring up, like you saw the simulation that Dr. Brown used, where you see what's going on inside the brain when you're using a cell phone near your head. So even if you have the over the ear, you're still going to get quite a bit of radiation. I suspect, and we have to wait for the modeling results to come in, that you do get far greater illumination of the brain by electromagnetic waves by something that goes in the ear canal as opposed to something that's over it. So it may be better, but it's an issue.
Is the one for the over the ear that has something that goes over your head? Do you know if there is a wire that's actually connecting the two, or
Yeah, I believe there is.
Okay, so it wouldn't be going through your brain, at least in theory, the same way that the earbuds are designed to do, the inner earbuds are designed to do.
I believe that's the case, but we need to verify that. And that's the type of thing an organization like ours will undertake, is answering questions like that.
Okay, did you guys want to check any more questions out of the chat? If not, I have some questions of my own.
Oh, I'll keep looking, but go ahead and fire away.
Well, I don't know if you answered the Starlink question. What were the thoughts on Starlink?
Ugh. The jury's still out for me. That there will only be a limited number of base stations. I wouldn't want to live near a Starlink base station. That's one thing I can say. My brother is going to get Starlink, and I'm not sure it's going to increase their exposure very much. And I believe that the exposure from the satellite, if you don't want to be radiated, you don't have to buy any equipment. You just can opt out in that case. So I'm looking, at some point I'm going to go make measurements at his house. When he does have Starlink, we'll turn it off and then turn it on and see if the equipment that you have to get yourself does create more radiation for those using it.
So,
Let me
oh,
clarify something.
sure.
In order for Starlink to work, you need to have a downlink to a fixed area. Now, sometimes the antenna for the downlink can be located 100 yards away from the home, but sometimes it's located directly on the roof, right over the bedroom, which would, of course, be the worst possible place because you want to keep your sleeping area, as Dr. Brown indicated, free of wireless radiation because wireless radiation interferes with melatonin, and melatonin helps repair damage that can happen to our cells just from being alive, just from breathing oxygen and sunlight. These things naturally occur and they cause damage. And if you sleep at night in the dark, away from wireless radiation, you've created a sleep sanctuary, which will be conducive to increasing your levels of melatonin. And melatonin is being studied in cancer centers around the world for its anti-cancer properties. So we know that you want melatonin to be produced, and we know that wireless radiation can interfere with it. Another way to reduce your exposures is to have your cell phone, when you absolutely need it, on airplane mode, but wireless on if you're in an area that has Wi-Fi. And that way you'll be able to get your phone to work and you won't have to use the cellular signal, which is the stronger of the signals to be exposed to.
So regarding the melatonin, just so I understand what you were saying, is it's kind of a double whammy insofar as one, it decreases your melatonin, which impacts your sleep, and two, because it's decreasing your melatonin, not only is it impacting your sleep, but it's actually preventing your body from remediating some of the damage that would be done from these signals in the first place.
Perfect. I
Okay.
don't know if Dr. Brown wants to add anything there.
They call it the sleep hormone, but really melatonin, it's related to sleep, but it doesn't cause sleep. So your body produces melatonin when it senses darkness at night. When the sun sets, you see reddish light. It kind of signals your brain that nighttime's coming, and you're supposed to be then in darkness when the sun's on the other side of the earth. And that's when your body produces melatonin and you go to sleep. Of course, we have lights in our homes, and we have these sources of radiation now. All of this electromagnetic field, the things that are producing this radiation, and it's affecting our melatonin production. So after the sun sets, our bodies don't know that the sun has set, and so we delay. Our melatonin production is delayed by the presence of these lights indoors, but also compounded on that is the Wi-Fi, because even then when you put yourself to sleep and you turn off the lights, your body's still getting energy. And so your brain doesn't really click on to the melatonin production like it's supposed to. And as Dr. Davis mentioned, we're discovering more and more of how important it is. And yes, it's important for clearing up tumors that start to develop. Tumors start from a single cell, but your body has natural killer cells and other cells that then can destroy them. And melatonin is really important for all of that to be effective. If you start messing around with melatonin production, your health will suffer. And taking supplements, I do not believe is effective. It may help you sleep, but I don't believe it's really going to help with all the other physiological properties in your body that are supposed to be designed with the circadian rhythm that we're all supposed to be a part of.
Are there any good blue blocker brands, the glasses, do those work? Are there any good ones on the market that you recommend?
They do work. I'm wearing a pair right now.
Are you all wearing blue blockers?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
As a radiologist, I'm looking at a screen for 7 or 8 hours a day. So I find that they do prevent me from getting headaches that I used to get after a full day's worth of work. So yeah, they help. They do distort the information coming into your eye to some degree. So I'm not sure they're completely without side effects, but in my experience, they've definitely been helpful.
Is there a reliable brand that you recommend? Because there's so many cheap pairs online. You know, you can get them for like $5 or $7. Are those just, are those good, or should we get, a better brand? And we can do our reviews, but most people don't have the expertise that you guys have to know what actually works and what doesn't work.
I actually want to answer that. I got a pair of blue blockers, and they came. These were low cost ones from China, and they came with their own little blue laser. And sure enough, you take the laser and you shine it through the lens, and nothing comes out the other side. But you do that with non-blue blocker lenses, and the light goes right through it. So, get one of those testers, and you can be confident then that it is indeed blocking something.
Okay. Was there? Do you mind sharing the brand?
Yeah, I mean, come on,
I use a
everyone,
brand
oh,
called
it's right
Prospect.
here. I'm not
Prospect.
endorsing a product. I'm not getting paid to
Uh,
do this. It's Zenni, Zenni.
Zenni. And oh, you know what? Actually, I think I've seen a YouTuber talk about Zenni eyewear,
Oh,
and
well, I've had really good luck. I've gone to my optometrist and they want $400 for my glasses. I get the same thing through Zenni, and they work actually better than the ones that I've paid a lot more for. And you can get options like the blue blocking.
so as we try to share this type of information with our loved ones, and given that most people aren't as capable of articulating the science behind all of this as the three of you are, how do you communicate to the people that you care about the dangers without sounding crazy? Because that's a problem, especially in this field.
It is a problem, and Environmental Health Trust has been working on this only for 15 years or more. And I will just say that the world is changing now, and thanks to the focus on internet addiction and the addictive properties of screens and the phenomena of screen agers and technoference and other terms that have come into our vocabulary, there's a growing public understanding that, like many good things, we are unfortunately using this technology to excess, and that we need to pull it back. And I think that if you ask people, we believe at Environmental Health Trust that all people say they care about children, particularly young children, and the damaging effects on young children, nobody can deny them. And we see occasionally, there's even on YouTube, infants that scream when you take away their iPad. Infants should not have iPads. Young children should not have time in front of screens. They need to get out and play and roll around in the mud and experience what it's like to be outdoors. And speaking of which, you have to be careful about the blue block glasses. Dr. Brown has a job which involves sitting in front of a screen 7 to 8 hours a day. He's well aware in his personal life of how he has to get outside. We need sunlight on our skin at 20 minutes a day if we're Caucasian to stimulate the development of vitamin D in our bloodstream. It's not healthy to be indoors all the time. And yet 90% of us, we spent 90% of our time indoors, unfortunately. So it's a balance, like as with all things. And communicating about this, I have been told that the TEDx talk I did is somewhat effective. I have no way to know. I think we're trying, and we're happy to work with you and others here to come up with short messages about why this is important. And I think, frankly, the imaging that Dr. Brown showed of the brain and its exposure to cell phone radiation, which was developed by Dr. Chamberlain, those imaging, I think, really helps people to understand, because as you know, we are trying to make the invisible visible. And by showing the physical effects and by showing the absorption patterns, that's what we're trying to do. And we welcome the opportunity to make it more publicly available. I see here in the chat, and I want to bring everybody's attention to it, that there will be the recording of our conversation available through the website for The Real Truth About Health under our categories of which I cannot even read all the code that follows afterwards. But the fact of the matter is this will become available. We will make it available as well by a link on our website. And we want to encourage everybody to please sign up for our newsletter and please look at our upcoming revision to our website for new information, including more videos of Dr. Chamberlain and Dr. Brown explaining why we are all so concerned about this. But I don't know, Dr. Brown, you have two quasi-teenage children or young adult children. How have you got them to change their habits?
When they were young, we had a rule they had to put their cell phones in a basket in the hallway, and it had to be done a half an hour before bedtime. So they were trained very, I mean, they did get their cell phones, unfortunately, when they were middle schoolers because all their friends had them. And I wasn't willing to fight against, I didn't want them to be ostracized by their friends. So, and I was of the belief that as long as you have a period of the day at nighttime when you're sleeping, without exposure to this radiation, that your body would then heal and you could undo the damage that was done during the day. So I turned off the Wi-Fi router at night, and all electronics were out of the bedroom, and they went through life, their adolescence that way. Now that they're in college, they do the same. They turn their cell phones off at night. They have their roommates turn their cell phones off at night. And they wear AirPods, unfortunately, but they use them sparingly. So just for a short amount of time each day. And they're both very healthy, normal kids, I think. So it seems to be
Wonderful
working for
children,
them.
right? Yes,
Yeah.
but let me just go back to this. I would say if a person needs to use an AirPod as opposed to a wired headset, then they should use a single one and not both of them. The trade-off between having the stereophonic sound and protecting the brain, there is no question that you want to protect the brain. And my preference is that they not use these things, or that they use speakerphone whenever possible. And of course, there are some circumstances where it's not possible. And so I always have, wired headsets in different pockets. And frankly, I'm not always good about keeping them in the right pocket. So that's always a trade-off in life. What we want is for industry to compete on safety. We want the right to buy safer technology. That's what we want. And we're looking forward to working with industry to make that happen. And it's going to be challenging, particularly given what's going on geopolitically with trade right now. The United States, it was estimated that if iPhones were to be made in the United States, they would cost $6,000 to $8,000 a piece. So that's obviously not feasible in the short term. Now, in the long term, who knows?
I'd like to add one thing about the AirPods. You go to the gym these days and everybody is exercising with these AirPods. You see them running down the street, and throwing in the combination of the noise for the sound going into your ear with the exercise, which is taking blood away from your ear, and then superimposing electromagnetic fields, which could potentially cause rouleau formation and the clumping of your blood, which could further decrease oxygen delivery to your middle ear, you could really exacerbate what's a condition called noise-induced hearing loss. And a lot of people are getting damage to their hearing from exercising with earbuds. So it's one more reason why you should not exercise with AirPods.
So,
Rob, I think that is a sufficiently important observation that it should be your next letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. That's a very important, no, really, Rob. That's why it's so exciting for me to have you now as Vice President for Scientific Research and Clinical Affairs, because you're able to put together the information that Kent has generated in terms of modeling and electrical engineering, and the information that we've worked in epidemiology, which is always too late, too little, to suggest that that hearing loss, which is being reported in younger people more and more, is something we can avoid. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is there are a number of unexplained patterns of illness in young people, including stroke and hearing loss, that could very well be tied with what's going on with their exposures to wireless radiation. So I'm going to have to say that thank you to my distinguished colleagues, and I would like to suggest that what we can do here, because there are so many questions that have been raised, is if you will send us the questions we have not answered, then EH Trust in the next month will put up a section on our website where we will answer them under Q's and A's. And Dr. Brown and Dr. Chamberlain and I can try to answer these questions. About the most important thing is distance is your friend. That's the most important thing we can tell you. Turn things off at night, keep distance where you can, and don't worry, because worrying isn't going to make a difference. And eat your vegetables will.
I
Right.
wonder if I could make a final comment. I see that we're running up on time, but people are asking, what can we do to better protect ourselves? And one way you can do it, and it was mentioned before, I think it was Dr. Davis, is that you can use your phone in Wi-Fi calling mode. And if you're not familiar with it, look it up on YouTube. It's so easy. You just click one switch on your iPhone and all of a sudden it's available to you. And the way this is important is that if you are using Wi-Fi calling rather than cellular, in other words, if you put your phone in airplane mode and your phone is connected to a Wi-Fi network, then you get complete functionality from your iPhone, but you're doing it with a far lower transmit power. For a typical cell phone, it will give you, it radiates at between, typical, between 0.6 watts and 3 watts. That's pretty powerful. That's a strong microwave transmitter. But if you're using Wi-Fi, then it goes only up to 100 milliwatts. And so you get this great coverage whenever, and you don't need to have a cell tower nearby as long as you have Wi-Fi. Great coverage, great communication, far lower exposure. So I just recommend that as a way for people to lower their own exposures.
So with regard to that recommendation, just so I understand and the audience understands, when you put the Wi-Fi calling on, it will change over to use Wi-Fi and shut down the cellular when you have access to a Wi-Fi signal.
Unfortunately, I'm glad you asked that. Thank you. So unfortunately, no, you have to do it manually. So right now I'm in airplane mode, but I'm Wi-Fi calling. So I have complete functionality for my phone, but I have to do it manually. I was a co-author on a paper that talks about ways that these iPhones can be made far lower radiation. There's a lot that can be done. And so in the beginning of my talk, I was, saying there's a lot we can do, but we have to, first of all, acknowledge that we have a problem with wireless radiation exposure.
And Dr. Havas has just pointed out, Dr. Havas, our most distinguished colleague, has just pointed out, you can also connect your cell phone with an adapter to wired Ethernet to connect to the internet. And that's important as well. But we do want to generally discourage Wi-Fi and lower power when possible. And for more information, please look at our website, Dr. Havas's website, so many others that are out there. And in our revised website, we will have better links to so many of the partners that we include, like Physicians for Safe Technology, and many others. So again, thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you.
Look at our website for more information. And we will ask you from the Real Truth Conference to give us a compilation of these questions, which I ask you to copy for us, and then share where people can get more information.
Yeah, so we will send you the questions from the chat. Just one quick clarification, then we'll wrap it up, which is with regard to the Wi-Fi calling. So then when you do have a Wi-Fi signal, you have to manually shut off cellular data. Is that correct?
Well, just put it into airplane mode.
No,
Or
Keep your Wi-Fi on, put it in airplane mode, and your phone works perfectly.
perfect.
In many cases, works better because you have usually a better signal.
Great. With that, that concludes our time together. Thank you so much for all the information. I have so many questions unanswered, so I'm going to try to head them up and add them to the list. If we can unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation for the doctors.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
God bless.